everyone. Today I'm very excited to interview my friend, Suzanne Ballantyne. She is a yoga teacher, but she is also one of my first teachers. I consider her one of my teachers, my spiritual teachers. And I'm very,
Mm.
very excited to interview her today on the Afterlife podcast. Suzanne, thank you for being here. And I want to just let everybody know that Zan and I call her Zan quite affectionately. And Zane and I have known each other is going on 8 years, and I consider our friendship to be very special. We are sort of a crossbreed, I would say, because Zan grew up Irish Catholic and she has adopted and adapted ways of Hinduism and Buddhism into her practices, whereas I grew up Hindu and have adapted and adopted the teachings of Jesus into my life. So this is a very unique friendship, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you for being on this show, Zan.
Pooja, I am so honored. Always, always, every time. So honored. I love our friendship. I love that you think of me as one of your teachers. I certainly think of you as one of my teachers. I think of most, for you and me, I think that most of the people that come into our lives are teachers for us in some form or fashion. And it's mostly us that recognizes the teaching that we're getting from being present and aware of how we're relating to people or what's going on between us. But yeah, thank you.
Zan, why don't you start us off with just kind of giving us a little bit of about your journey? Like you grew up Irish Catholic and you've ended up, adopting and adapting, like I said, the practices of Buddhism and some Hinduism as well. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, I can for you. So I often say that I was born a poor Irish Catholic girl, but not as poor Irish and Catholic as my mother. And I believe that with each generation, we carry the energy of our ancestors, first and foremost, our parents. These are the people with whom we spend so much time. And I say we're steeped in the tea of our ancestors. So the energy, really, right? We spend so much time with these people, and we're not even aware, especially early on in our lives, how we are picking up the habits, behaviors, thought patterns, actions of these people that we spend so much time with. So it comes to be our work as we wake up, if we wake up, to see how all of that behavior, those actions, those thought patterns have inhabited us in a way, because they're habits, but we imitate those, right? The easiest way to learn is imitation, which I take from a Chinese philosopher. The most bitter way to learn, just to finish that thought, the easiest way to learn is imitation, the most bitter is experience, and the most noble is reflection. So if we see ourselves, I could just let it go there. We begin to have this capacity to unwind some of the behaviors and actions and thought patterns that have been sort of downloaded into us, if you will, through by this imitation and experience. It isn't all bitter. Some of the experience is um, lovely. Um, and sometimes because we're having a good experience, it's not necessarily not bitter either, because then we take, that behavior or pattern or experience that we've had, and we maybe give it too much positivity or anyway, we still have to continue to question what
Mhm,
we've taken on in our habits.
mhm,
And you and I know, Pooja, that as people who are very interested in health and wellness,
mhm,
that if we discover that something about us that we've taken on
mhm.
by family lifestyle imitation is not that healthy, we can't, in a way, forgive me, everybody, continue to say, oh, it's genetic.
Mhm.
Because there's a great portion, this is another story, of course, but this is one of the reasons that we do want to wake up and see whether or not the behaviors and thought patterns and actions that we take, the beliefs, the core beliefs, the values that we take from our families and our past generations, are we being served by them, or are they a bit of a hindrance? So at some point, of course, I woke up and realized that a lot of my behavior and thought patterns and beliefs were the behaviors, thought patterns, and beliefs of my mother. And I say that not even knowing if my mother adapted them, just by virtue of osmosis, in a way, is what happens, by imitation, by just having them downloaded, or if she took the time to reflect on what was and what wasn't. And of course, I know that she did, because we had many conversations as she was aging. Sometimes we didn't even have the conversation. She would just make a comment, and it would leave me so surprised that she'd stepped outside the dogma. But it made me smile too. So I would also just take a breath and think, oh, good. She's also stopping to reflect about some of the things that she's inherited. Um, so yeah, at some point, I think I would have to, well, just when I was 19, I got interested. I discovered that there was such a thing as Christian meditation.
Mhm.
So I took a course called The History and Practice of Christian Meditation, which was taught by a Benedictine monk. And I used to go to, I forget what they called it. It was an old estate that had been donated, a priory. It had been donated to the Benedictine monks, and I would go for meditation and vespers. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I liked it. I liked the ritual. I liked being quiet.
Mhm.
I liked the idea,
Mhm.
of being there. And I always wondered, why the heck didn't anybody in our catechism at church ever talk about this meditation that was available to Christians? The only thing I knew was that my mother had a cousin who became a Carmelite nun, and she was silent for 2 years. And I just know that that completely fascinated me for some reason.
Mhm.
And sometimes the things that stick with us, especially the things we don't understand why, are the things that we will continue to pursue for some reason.
Mhm.
In a book by Lama Surya Das called well, if it's in my bookshelf, I'll be able to see it from here. It is. Hang on a
Oh,
second.
sure.
Thank you. Awakening the Buddha Within, Lama Surya Das.
Mhm.
And he talks about paying attention to this pithy information, this information that sort of sticks out for us on our path.
Mhm.
Um, so the people who say things, they become our teachers, even if we never actually meet them, right? We just hear something, and for some reason it touches us
Mhm.
here in our hearts. Or um, so I, yeah, began this journey sort of seeking and being curious, but having no idea what I wanted to do with it. And after being at university for a couple of years, I came back and I went to the priory and I saw Father Lawrence, and I asked him, um, or I told him, I don't really know why I keep coming back, because I'm not going to church, and I don't even, I didn't even know how much of it I had even uh, worked with, like processed at that point in my life, early 20s.
Mhm.
And he said to me, well, then just carry on with your life and see whether or not it keeps coming back. And so that's what I did. And it didn't really come back until I started taking yoga
Mhm.
in my early to mid 30s.
Mhm.
And and then of course I went back to meditation through yoga, and began began a more concerted journey. I won't say that I was totally devoted yet. Um, that took, I was having children. I was a householder, as we know it to be in some philosophies and some descriptions of the like Ayurveda, right? You're going through life. And so the first third of life, you're developing yourself and training and getting educated and building the foundation for your life. And the second third of life, you're sort of, they call it morning. They also say morning, noon, and evening, right? So you're in the afternoon of your life, and you could be in career or householder. You could be looking after children. You could be looking after your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that's over, you have this last third. I also say um, that this third act, we say it in every day, like from 0 to 30 is the first act, from 30 to 60 is the second act. And when we get to our third act, we may not have the children at home anymore. We may not have the parents to look after anymore. And so we arrive in this space. Now I'm trying to think of the word for it. I think it starts with S. Um, and it's the point of life where you prepare to leave, right? We take our first breath when we're born.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I never thought about that until I was in my 30s and 40s, taking all this yoga and reading all this
Mm-hmm.
um, reading the Yoga Sutras and reading all these books by different people who are either Buddhist or Hindu, and then my teacher and the books that were assigned to us for yoga. I've taken 2 trainings, and now my teacher reminds us often we take our first breath at birth, we take our last breath when we die. And it makes sense, right? We have to take an in breath to start the life, and we have to take an out breath to let go.
Let go. Yes.
To
Yes.
let go. So it's been a slow, gradual journey. And I've learned that about myself, that I've never done anything quickly. I still don't do things very, I mean, it's not true. I move around the house quickly. I get things done quickly. I can be quite energetic and spry. Um, and perhaps that's why I'm so drawn to the speed of meditation and being still, because I needed it to balance myself. But the way that I study and learn seems to me anyway to be I don't mean slow in a bad way at all. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's just very slow and gradual for me, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the way I digest things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It's more organic. Yes,
yeah,
for
yeah.
sure. And that's something that I love about your journey, Zan, because when I met you, I was coming out of a very fundamentalist, legalistic kind of a church group, which was almost like a cult. And for that reason, I had gotten very disconnected from my Hindu roots. But I always laugh when I think about this Irish Catholic friend that helped me to become comfortable once more and feel at home within my roots, you know? So I appreciate you for that. I mean, just,
I, well, I just thought it was so interesting that you were in America from your country, and I was in America from my country,
yes,
and we met, and we both
yeah.
crossed into each other's
And I have
inherited.
I forgot to tell the listeners that Zan is actually joining us from Canada. so so
I
yes,
am.
yes,
I'm joining you
absolutely.
from
And
Canada.
the other thing, Zan, we talk about spiritual things, we talk about the afterlife. On this afterlife podcast, I interviewed a lot of people that have had near-death experiences, been on the other side, you
Mhm.
know, however you want to call it, the fifth dimension, heaven, astral plane, use whatever word makes you,
That's
that makes
consciousness.
sense.
You can just
Makes
call it
sense.
pure consciousness,
Pure
right?
consciousness, right? And then when
Yeah.
we come back, their lives are changed forever. And I've
Mhm.
often thought, that what if, maybe we don't need something like that always to have a big change or a big transformation. And
Yeah.
I know you had an NDE, which wasn't exactly like you didn't leave your body, but you almost
No.
had a very similar experience. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And I didn't even when things happen sometimes and you don't die, you're so caught up in the aftermath of the accident. So for me it was a car accident. And And of course, my mother was injured and my sister was injured. And so I had to drive us to the next nearest, get our bearings, first a rest stop and then a hospital that people at the rest stop were able to direct us to. And it wasn't necessarily life threatening. My mom had a fairly severe head injury that, blackened both her eyes and she had a concussion. So they kept her overnight to observe her. Um, but but I remember I was in the back seat because I'd let my sister drive. And we were going over an overpass where you've all seen the signs that say bridge may be icy. Because bridge is ice first, it's different wording, but we've all seen those signs. And so as we were heading over the bridge, my sister hit black ice. And of course, our first instinct is to hit the brake, which set the car spinning. And I had, sort of been watching. It was dark, it was nighttime, and it was December. We were on our way to my brother's for Christmas. And I had seen guardrails, no guardrails, guardrails, no guardrails. So when I heard my mother say, "Here we go," I thought we were going, like no guardrail. And I knew that the side of the road was lower down. We managed to make it over the bridge, I think. It's been more than 30 years now. And thank God, because we spun a few times, we ended up heading into a guardrail, which stopped us. And, again, by the grace of God, the universe, nature, in that moment, there was nobody else coming because we were perpendicular to the road when we came to the stop. But I will say that in that moment that my mom said, "Here we go," I feel like it must have been a very innate effort to just say, "Okay, here we go, let go." My life did not flash before my eyes. I don't remember feeling terrified. I remember just saying, "All right, then, I'm going to have to surrender to this." Right? This could very well be the end, and I don't have time to think about it. So I'm just going to relax. And I remember feeling, I just showed you this book that I'm reading, How We Live is How We Die by Pema Chodron. And she's talking about dissolution. And it just occurred to me that I had this innate capacity or awareness or wisdom to just let go, not to fight it. And then, of course, there was quite a blow, and nobody said anything for a moment. And then, you're a bit in shock, right? And then we started to reach out for each other. Are you okay? Are you? And unfortunately, my mother had taken her seatbelt off to take her winter coat off because the car had warmed up since we'd stopped for gas. So she wasn't buckled. And she went right into the windshield and broke it with her head. But I didn't know, right? I didn't know because it was dark. I couldn't see that, right? So that's what I mean about I had this experience, but I didn't have really time to process it because I knew that my sister was in pain from having the seatbelt and getting the big jolt. And I was somehow holding myself. So I was bracing myself. So I didn't have the big smack that they had. And I got out of the car and I got some snow for my mom to put on her head because I knew she'd banged it, but I didn't realize how hard. And off we went. I'll leave it at that. But for years later, and because I'm married to someone who was unconscious for 7 days and describes rising out of his body and watching himself going into the ambulance after a motorcycle accident, I think it just brought back some memories for me, and maybe listening to all the NDEs that I've heard on your channel as well, because I know I've listened to at least half a dozen of the stories of people and read a couple of books that you've recommended over the years. So it just at some point, I just think I went back to that memory and I thought, wow, that was so interesting. I had no fear in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
I just really attribute it to some sort of natural wisdom, which I learn more and more about through yoga all the time. I tell my students, your body is perhaps wiser than your mind. And we really need to pay attention to what we're learning from the feedback of our bodies.
I love that. I love that on so many levels because of death, even getting close to it, right? If it's if you know that it's coming for everybody. But if you know if we're sick or something happens and we're like, oh my God,
Yes.
this thing is now approaching faster than we hoped for,
Yes.
it can be very scary. But you know, listening to you actually brings me a lot of comfort because of this innate wisdom that we have to let go, to accept. And then it just makes the whole thing that much easier, doesn't it?
I think so. I mean, it takes practice for us intellectually
Mhm.
because we live in a culture that's terrified of death. A lot
Yeah.
of the time, we don't like to talk about it.
Mhm.
And when it happens, the grief is enormous.
Yes.
Um, of
Mhm.
course, death out of sequence is
Mhm.
what really
Mhm.
takes us by surprise.
Mhm.
And yet, it's happening all the time.
All the time.
It's
Yeah.
just not happening to us, but it's every day. We watch the news.
Yeah.
We know that people are dying by accident, by illness, by force, for lack of a better word, but that's good enough for me. Um, and and I think that well, in Pema Chodron's book, she said that one of the Tibetan practices, because she's a Tibetan monk, is to think about death 5 times a day,
Mhm.
to become more familiar with it,
Mhm.
to become more comfortable with it.
Mhm.
And the irony, I remember lending you a book too from
The Dalai Lama.
might, might have been a doctor. It wasn't Dalai Lama. He was at Harvard University, and he wrote a book, "Living in the Light of Life" or something like that.
Yes.
"Living in the Light of Death."
Yeah.
Yeah, because that is also an expression, right, of
Mhm. Mhm.
among monks of different backgrounds. They're,
Yeah. Yeah.
Tibetan or Buddhist or whatever. And when we live in that light,
Mhm.
it tends to brighten our actual life
Mhm.
because we're not hiding from it. We're not pretending it's not coming.
Mhm.
We're making choices knowing it's coming.
Mhm.
And that can, in fact, since how we live is how we die, get us more comfortable with dying. I also I found this title interesting too, right? Because I have I wasn't able to be with my mom as much as I would have liked as she was dying because I wasn't here in Canada. But
Mhm.
I was here for the death of my mother-in-law last year
Mhm.
and the decline and the hospice
Mhm.
and I just remember that expression, how you live is how you die. I've heard many people say it. And it was true of my mother-in-law, and it was true of a friend of mine that I lost very recently. And I think it's not just that we take the same personality into death that
Mhm.
we've lived with. So if we're cranky and, you know, nasty, we're going to be
Mhm.
cranky and nasty when we die.
Mhm.
Um, they do say that there are some people that are bitter and angry and just focus on the pain and the loss and really try hard not to let go.
Mhm.
And other people are themselves right up to the moment, but doesn't mean that they don't have fear. My husband's
Mhm.
mom had quite a bit of fear. And
Mhm.
I sent a message with him to the hospital once. There's a cute story if we have time for it.
Yes, of course.
We knew that she was upset because she would call and tell him about her dreams and the things that were happening in her dreams and how she was locked or left in a long corridor in the hospital, and nobody was coming to see her, and the people that did come to see her were very mean and nasty. And so we just equated this with her sort of fear of some kind of hell. And
Mhm.
she wasn't a religious woman, but she was married to a Catholic man,
Mhm.
but she never went to church or converted or
Mhm.
and so I said to Mark, I said, well, when you go see your mom, whenever there's a window of opportunity in the conversation, I'd like you to tell her, for me, that I think death is a bit like birth, and that when she gets there, there'll be people waiting for her, or there'll be loving energy waiting for her, whatever that is, and that there's nothing to worry about, that it's just another transition.
Yeah.
And, I don't know, I may have said, and watch for the light or something sort of generic like that, right? And he came back and told me that he did tell her. I don't know if it was the same day and she apparently rolled her eyes because she would sometimes, she's not the first person to find me a little bit Pollyannish, or, too spiritual, too much of a seeker. You probably run into it also.
I do.
Um,
I've been told I live in a la la land.
yeah, you're too woo woo. And I get it, right? Because I think the long period of time that it took me from when Father Lawrence told me just to forget about meditation then, and not keep following the path, until I found myself back on the path. For that period of time, there was a part of me that wanted to sort of run from the dogma.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know how to incorporate a person that wrote poetry and felt like a seeker and wanted to study religion, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I studied the Mormons, I took sociology of religion, I took Jesus Christ, myth and reality,
Yeah.
I took world religions, I took Aboriginal, a course in Aboriginal religions as well, First Nations. And I think that I just had to go back to it to find the faith, my faith,
Mm-hmm.
not a blind faith that the church asked me to
Mm-hmm.
aspire to or just take on,
Mm-hmm.
um, handed down. I much preferred the philosophy of Buddha
Mm-hmm.
and Hinduism and Buddhism. And I'm not sure about Hinduism, actually. You'll have to tell me. Do they also say, don't take my word for it?
No, the reason I said that I find that you've adopted some of the practices is because you've studied the Yoga Sutras, and
Yes.
they have a lot of the philosophies that you'll find in India. So,
Of course, because a lot of it comes out of the Upanishads. It's
yeah,
also in the and Bhagavad Gita, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So
But would those books also have said things like, don't take my word for it, go out and experience, take up the practice and learn for yourself?
I think I think the original Vedas had like a lot of like rituals and things like that. But I think there was like when you start getting towards the commentaries, and then there were commentaries on the commentaries and that
Yes.
whole series, I think
Yes.
that's where more of the self-reflections was coming in towards the end, like the Vedantas.
Okay.
They did talk about that. So
And I feel the opposite in Christianity. I don't know, but I feel like, so the history and practice of Christian meditation was active in the
yes,
14th, 15th, 16th century, perhaps.
totally the Desert Fathers, yes. Mhm.
Right. But then there seemed to have been
Yeah,
less interpretation, that, we were driven more toward a dog. We're going to interpret it for you,
yes.
and we'll tell you how to
How
understand
to
it. At
feel
least
them.
that was my feeling. I
Yeah.
I certainly have no problem with people who follow the teachings of, as you know, the
Yeah.
teachings of Jesus,
Mhm.
and who call themselves Christian.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
but
and I could
I'm
go off
also, I'm wary of who I'm reading and what's
and,
being interpreted.
and
And
I could go off on a whole tangent about the
yes,
teachings
one could.
versus the teachings that you get from an institution. Sometimes they're not the same.
Organized.
Yeah,
Yeah.
organized.
Yeah,
Yes.
same in all religions, actually. And
Mhm.
I prefer to leave that to religion and come back to mysticism,
Yes.
into the mysteries,
Yeah.
into ancient wisdom.
Hmm.
I find them very different than modern religion.
Yes.
Yeah, because
Mhm.
I'm fascinated also by Kabbalah,
Yeah.
depending on which Jewish person you ask, actually,
Mhm.
because I've heard different Jewish people.
Yeah.
Um, but I think Jewish mysticism is as fascinating and inviting and rich with wisdom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hear you. I hear you. That's the thing. We live in this world where structures are important, and yet our hearts and our souls, and you and I have talked about this before, we want to run off into the woods and write poetry and commune with God, but
Yes.
yeah, but in society, I guess we need some rules and we need to abide by some things. So I guess religion does have a place and a
Yes.
value in that sense.
So that was just quickly, those 10 years then were me trying to figure out how do I navigate the dogma they taught me that I'm supposed to keep practicing in order to get into heaven,
Mm,
and my doubt. And I found, I mean, there's lots of things. Of course, I had lots of experiences. I lost my father when I was 20. And so there were difficult times, of course, that also undermined my confidence and my faith. But it's really yoga and studying the Yoga Sutras and the yoga texts that I've read that have brought me back to faith in myself, confidence in myself. And
mhm,
I think that's the most important piece that we can help people find and
mhm,
discover and continue to work with so that they can find that inner wisdom. And when it's your turn to let go, you can let go. You're
mhm.
going to trust. You're going to have faith.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you kind of read my mind because my next question was actually going to be that about, a lot of the NDE stories that I've heard and people that I've interviewed. And a lot of the data is coming out of the University of Virginia, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm a member of that. And we they look at the data and they try to find the commonalities, right? And definitely there's two things. One is how you live is how you die. That actually turns out to be very, very real, because a lot of times people, the state in which they die, right, like their consciousness or their reality,
Yes.
they carry
Yes.
that forward. And
Yes.
that's possibly their immediate experience, not the trauma, like not if they were in a car accident, they're not experiencing the trauma, but they're experiencing who they are, their very essence in that, you know so there's that. But then also on the other side, they talk about love and connection. And I've
Mm.
often wondered, and again, this is going back to my love for the teachings of Jesus. And one of the things, is the Lord's Prayer that I love very much. And there's a line in there which says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So right there's a clue for me that there is a heaven here too. Or
Oh,
that at least
absolutely.
that's the end game, or that's the end goal. At least that's how I look at it.
Yes.
Like the whole
Yes.
planet is to be
Yes.
lifted up to that vibration, right? Do you feel that in your practice of yoga, do you feel that love, that connection, finding that kingdom within?
Oh, absolutely. That is the purpose of meditation, is to
Mhm,
find that stillness and that spaciousness
mhm,
and samadhi, this union
mhm,
with everything so that you're not caught up in conception, concepts, I mean, conceptual thinking. You're
mhm,
not caught up in worry. You're actually not caught up in the world of name and form.
mhm,
There's no need to have an aversion for anything or want more of something else.
mhm,
Um, we don't have attachment. We don't have um, disgust. It's not, it's not a
mhm,
very common word in the sacred text, but I'm using it. And aversion is the better word.
mhm,
You just everything is sattvic. Everything is clear,
mhm,
crystal clear,
mhm,
and you recognize the difference between the world of name and form and our own true nature,
mhm,
which is this light of consciousness.
mhm.
Purusha
Yeah,
is the yoga term.
yeah.
Um,
And I think
so
at
yeah,
first.
I think that's the whole point, is for us to keep practicing finding that space
Mhm.
so that we can find it on our way out.
Yes, to be present in every moment as much as we can.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And I really think that's where the secret sauce is, to find even those glimpses of heaven that we dream about. It's right here, right
Exactly.
now, inside us, right? Um, and,
Yeah.
and I think inside us, and in when we are co-creating, like in this moment, when
Yeah.
just watching you on this screen and talking to you is lifting me up,
Mm.
right? I feel like right here in this little space, there is a little bit of heaven, you know? So,
Yes.
talk.
Yes, and my friend Brian, who just left us, and I'm saying his name out loud, um, his and his wife who predeceased him, their message was to keep looking for the beauty.
Mm-hmm,
And it is the beauty that is the love, that is the connection, that is the true essence. That's our true essence. And I feel that the stillness and the slowing down and the time to look inside a flower and the time to notice the change in a bud overnight,
mm-hmm,
um, it's this speed. You remember I had my t-shirt that said yield to the speed of nature.
mm-hmm,
It is this speed of nature that gives us the practice to be present enough, to be conscious enough, to practice being more conscious than unconscious,
mm-hmm,
because we live in these human bodies, right? The veil comes down, we forget, we're not sinful,
mm-hmm,
we're forgetful. Um, and because we practice so much, we're not going to miss it.
mm-hmm,
And it's in the slowing down that we also find out more and more about the values and beliefs and teachings and downloaded information,
mm-hmm,
but the automatic stuff, the unconscious behaviors and thought patterns, we can't see them unless we slow down to pay attention.
mm-hmm.
So, can I give you an example? This is from the notes that I sent you the other
Yes,
day.
please.
I just have to read my note again to jog my memory.
That's totally fine.
Right. Okay. So I think this is a stellar example for this. And I hope that you and your listeners get this. My son was here and he was telling me something about work and, we're all each other's teachers, right?
Yeah.
And I began to have a reaction to what he was saying to me. And and it happened to be the day that my friend Brian died. So my brain was a little bit foggy. I was sad. I had spent some, time being very distracted by the loss and the shock, which is just part of being human. So I found myself sort of being short and not thoughtful and coming entirely from an unconscious reactionary place. And I said some things to my son, which I felt justified. And he soon dismissed himself from the conversation. It wasn't rude, but he saw what was happening maybe faster than I did, which is the beauty of passing it on from generation to generation. Because I was in that moment about to pass on something that was unconsciously ingrained in me, a reaction to something he said about whether his work ethic or something. And so I behaved the way my parents would have behaved with me. And he caught it. And he sort of saw that that was just coming from this irritated place behind the veil, unconscious. I wasn't awake. I wasn't creating
Mhm.
a heaven. I
Mhm.
wasn't creating love. I wasn't creating warm connection. And after he left, I sat with that and I was able to see exactly what happened. I didn't use any skillfulness in my response. I didn't bring myself, like, take a breath and become conscious and recognize a bad teaching, an untrue teaching that had just been downloaded into me, and a belief that I was then going to impose on him. But he and I have done a lot of work together, and he's done some yoga and he's worked with my teacher, and he's much more aware in his 20s than I was in mine. So we had a conversation about it later, and I said, that wasn't me talking to you. That was my mother or my father, right? That was a very unconscious opinion
Mhm.
that came out of me as a reaction. It wasn't thoughtful or skillful. There was no reflection. And afterwards, I just, I felt grateful for that moment because that moment was a teaching. That was the real teaching. Is how could I have been more conscious in that moment? How could I have come from a place of kindness? How could I have just asked a question to provoke some contemplation in my son rather than a critique, what felt like a criticism or something pejorative?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that's what I wanted to share with. That's the difference between heaven and hell for me, in a way. I mean, it's heaven and hell are big words for that little moment, but that's the difference between unconscious and conscious,
Unconscious, yeah.
which, I would say unconscious is a little bit more like hell and conscious is a bit more like heaven.
I actually am very glad that you shared that, Sam, because that brings me to my next point. I talk to a lot of people. We're all trying to build our practices, whether we're trying to connect to spirit, God, you know, spirituality can, but I have also found that, whether it's religion or spirituality, it can quickly become a trap also, where if we feel like we can't be human or we have to be perfect or always live on that plane, which is not possible, right? So I think practicing self-forgiveness, self-compassion is probably very, very important, alongside no matter what religious or spiritual beliefs we have.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
because so I think Eckhart Tolle talks about the pain body, right? Like this
Mhm.
mass wound, right? In the
Yeah.
collective. And we're not,
Yeah. Individual and collective.
yes. And then if you happen to be an empath, double whammy, right? You pick up more of that. So, and also what you talked about, what we learned from our parents and from our culture and
Yes.
other things, what's right and wrong is so many times determined by your culture, the social norms, right? And
Even how we talk to ourselves.
yeah, and
We just,
like you said, unconsciously
Mhm.
transmit that. And I think the first place for me, especially, where I have transferred that would have to be my spouse and my kids,
Mm.
because they have to live with me.
Yes.
So, so having to practice self-forgiveness and that compassion, and knowing that we are loved through it all, that no matter, what we do, how it impacts the person, if our intentions are pure, and if we're, I like to think of it as if truly that wasn't our intention. It's just that unconscious act. I think there's a lot of grace.
And I do think that practicing forgiveness and love and compassion with ourselves is exactly what gives us the courage to say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. That didn't come from my conscious self. That came from my unconscious self. And not to feel badly about the mistakes of being human,
Hmm.
but be okay with recognizing them and taking responsibility for them.
Yeah, yeah.
Because this is something else that we also learn in our families. Often, many people can never take responsibility for their behavior because they lived with parents who would never apologize or never admit that they were wrong. And and so you're absolutely right. And if my practice didn't have that kind of love and compassion and forgiveness, I wouldn't have been able to admit to my son
Agree.
because my my parents had a little bit of it, so I think they taught me some of this also. They were a little bit past that self-righteous parenting that may have been, come passed down with the cane and the walloping and the parents can never be wrong and you have to have respect for your elders no matter what.
Mhm,
My parents were able to apologize sometimes, and
mhm.
that was the beginning of me being able to have that in my practice, to not feel like I can't. Just because I'm older doesn't mean I'm better. Just because I'm older doesn't mean I don't owe you respect. So, how can we teach? How can we pass on these teachings and this idea if we don't model it?
Thank you, Zan, because that goes back. I'm connecting this back to this phrase, on earth as it is in heaven, because every time we catch ourselves and we apologize, I think that brings about some healing. That
Absolutely.
we're pushing not the pain body, but the healed body. That's what I want to push.
It raises the level of consciousness,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
right? That's the
Yeah.
heaven.
Hmm.
And it helps us diminish
Yeah.
the fear, the dark. Yeah.
Zen, I have like I can go on talking to you forever and ever.
No, we always
There's
can.
so much to learn from you, that I don't. I want to be respectful of your time as well. I just do want to ask you a couple of things. Do you have? You've been giving us a lot of wisdom, but is there anything that you want to share with us? That is your favorite practice for? It could be spiritual. It could be for wellness, because I think those are connected deeply, anyways. Is there one small little thing, one favorite practice of yours, or one small little thing that we could do to lift our own vibration?
Well, I'll echo my teacher and actually a colleague of mine who's also a student of Gary's, and that is that really 5 minutes a day
Mm,
of being present with yourself, of setting a timer. You can download an app onto your phone. You can do all those fancy things,
mhm,
but really giving yourself the gift of 5 minutes of
mhm,
sitting still.
mhm,
And if you have a pet at home, just notice that dogs and cats, they often just sit still and
mhm,
they aren't always sleeping, but they're able to stay in this place of stillness. And I think that that might be one of the first teachings of awareness is that we don't have to be moving, talking, thinking, acting all of the time. That sitting still and breathing is enough to be well. So that's my first thing, 5 minutes a day. My second thing is practice making your practices, because we're all individuals, it's a personal practice.
mhm,
We come together in community or sangha, as we say in yoga, to practice together, to go over the teachings, to ask questions, to learn from each other. But we don't come together to practice postures and meditation to keep talking, right? But sometimes our minds have a very difficult time getting quiet, which is why we have to teach the body to get quiet first, and the mind follows. And if you have trouble quieting your mind, another thing that's worked for me is yoga nidra.
mhm,
And you can go on YouTube and search yoga nidra 10 minutes, whatever you've got time for, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 15 minutes. Sometimes I do them right before I fall asleep at night. And what I find happens is my mind gets taken by the music or the someone's voice who's helping me relax. And that is another way to teach our bodies to relax. It's our nervous systems that need to be turned off
mhm,
because we don't, in the culture we live in, we think relaxing is watching TV, but there's still so much brain activity going on when we're watching something else.
mhm,
So we really have to get quiet, preferably close your eyes. If you're not comfortable in the beginning, you can just soften your gaze and stare at the floor or one a single point, something you love, whatever, a glass of water, a
mhm,
picture, a
mhm,
symbol that means something, and just teach your body to get quiet.
mhm,
And then as your body learns to get quiet, you can maybe spend some time learning some meditation techniques. And
mhm.
but it can also be music. Sometimes I listen, look for beauty, follow beauty. Sometimes I just listen to chanting, and it's the
Yeah,
same chant over and over again. And because I don't understand it all the time, and sometimes I do because I've been doing this for a long time, but in the beginning we don't understand the chant.
right.
And it's the fact that we don't understand it that
Yes,
allows it to just soften the mind.
absolutely. I've always, Zen, it's true. Words can get in the way sometimes, right? Yeah,
Yes,
this morning I was just listening to the birds, sitting outside on my porch listening to the birds, and yeah, I don't know what they're saying, but it was beautiful.
that is a beautiful practice
Yeah,
right
yeah,
there. Just
yeah,
staring at a tree and
yeah,
recognizing how still nature is.
yes,
And look what it's doing for us.
that's lovely. I just love you so much, and I am. hate that I have to cut this
The
off.
feeling's mutual. I love you, love you, love you. And you have taught me so much about love and
Thank you.
patience and kindness.
Thank you.
That's helped move my practice along. So,
Thank you. Thank you
yeah.
very much.
And to your listeners, if you've had an NDE or you haven't had an NDE, just keep cultivating faith in yourself. Keep trusting that, well, Frank Ostaseski, who Mark and I heard speak when we were in Costa Rica, he just says life, death, life, death, life, death, life, death, life, death, life, death, life.
Okay.
They aren't separate.
Yes. They're not. They're
They're
not.
part of the cycle.
From life to life. Thank you
And
so much.
yeah,
Thank you so much for joining us, Anne. And to all those who are watching and listening, thank you for tuning in. I am your host, Pooja Chilukuri. Until next time.